Rangers faithful, welcome to the latest edition of the Rink Rap Podcast here at Forever Blueshirts. I'm your host, Jim Cerny. Thanks for coming to hang out with us just a little bit after the Mike Sullivan press conference, the introductory conference, his presser as new coach of the New York Rangers, the 38th coach in franchise history. And we're going to share thoughts about the press conference, share behind of Sully. You kind of know where I stand on this after Molly Walker and I talked about it last week and the week before, even though Sullivan hadn't been hired yet, I kind of weighed in. To me, he was the guy. Okay. And, I know we can pick it apart and, Molly and Larry Brooks tried to write columns explaining why, hey, this guy's not the perfect candidate, but really at the end of the day, he's the candidate. He was the candidate. He was the guy. And so Chris Jury said it today at the press conference. He said, second, and that's the word that he used, the second that it became official that Mike Sullivan had parted ways with the Pittsburgh Penguins, he was the only target for the New York Rangers. And they immediately went to work on meeting with Sullivan and working quickly and aggressively, again, using Jury's words, quickly and aggressively to get Sullivan under contract ASAP to become coach of the New York Rangers. That's exactly what they got done. So we'll get into what Jury and Sullivan said earlier today. There wasn't a lot, nothing earth-shattering to say the least, which is the way the New York Rangers like it, of course. And listen, after such a tumultuous season, I can understand why they'd like to keep it nice and clean and simple, which is what it was today. But there were some highlights for sure, some takeaways. In fact, I wrote my takeaways column right after the press conference, and you can find that at foreverblueshirts.com as well. So please read that. Thanks for following me, by the way, at Jim Cerny on X, at 4, Ever Blue Shirts, also on X. And of course, for liking and subscribing to the Rink Rap Podcast over at the Forever Blue Shirts YouTube page. So, all that said, it's a story that I wrote because it's just not worth it, but I think it's more podcast worthy just to throw out there. This press conference was so New York Rangers, right? Gets up there, gives you 40 seconds on the hire and why Mike Sullivan is going to be a great coach and has been a great coach, great resume. He hit all the high points, and then he introduced Sully because Chris Jury really doesn't like being up there talking. Okay, that's fine. Sully gets up there and, that nice little introductory speech, answers some questions. He's up there for about 20 minutes. But really, the Rangers controlled this entire thing. So the beat writers in the room, pretty much each got to ask one question. And then there were other people that asked questions as well. I think Larry Brooks asked 2. I think Dan Rosen asked 2. Exactly how the Rangers like it. And for the most part, they were, not really provocative questions. A lot of softballs, just kind of introductory type stuff, right? And, Mike Sullivan was able to take it down this path, that path, basically say exactly what he wanted to say. Okay, that tends to be the way it is up at the podium at these press conferences. But here's where the Rangers go down the Rangers path, and other teams tend to do something else, which is more common. Rangers don't like common. They like to do things the Rangers way. And I know you hear me say this a lot. I used to work there and everything. I don't say that it's a pat on. It's just to provide some context. How the organization thinks from the top down, from James Dolan all the way down. It filters down. There is about how they want to control the message as best they can. Now, this year, a lot of that went out of whack. And that did not sit well within the organization and all the way up the food chain to the owner. Anyway, so when they're done at the podium, I'm expecting that the PR people then are going to separate into groups. TV people and radio people, you go here, we'll bring Mike Sullivan to you. beat writers and all print journalists, you go over here and then you'll get your turn with Sullivan as well. Because especially the beat writers and writers in general, they don't want their hardest questions, their most intense, provocative questions. They don't like ask those, where immediately it's going to be out on, on TV, or the video clip is going to be on social media or whatever. They try and save their best stuff, what they think are going to elicit the most provocative answers and the biggest topics, what have you. They like doing it in a smaller, controlled setting. Okay, I'm asking the question. I really want to know this about, what do you really think about Mika Zibanejad? Did you talk to him yet? Is he all in? Does he want to stay? What do you think? What do you and Chris Joy? Do you agree about Mika Zibanejad? I'm just, using him as an example. Well, there was no opportunity for the writers to ask those questions because there was no individual sit downs. Drury and Sullivan, they walked right out the side door and into the afternoon. That was it. They were done. 20 minutes up at the podium, done. Now listen, of course it's a good event, and it's on TV, it's on MSG Network, and they are promoting, and they should be proud of hiring two-time Stanley Cup winning coach as their new coach. Great. But we didn't get really any hard news out of this. And guess what? The Rangers love that. That's what they want. So, if the writers thought that they were going to be able to ask, the more, detailed questions, the more important topics, for their stories, well, guess what? They didn't get that opportunity. Now, doesn't mean they couldn't have asked when he was up there at the podium, instead of asking some generic type question, there could have been harder questions, broached to the new coach, but they really weren't. Think of the topics that we didn't hear about. We don't have Mike Sullivan's opinion. I mentioned Mika Zibanejad. We don't have his opinion about Chris Kreider's future, with the organization. Country, where does he stand? Alexi Lafreniere, what does he make, of their futures and of what just happened this past season? Now, he was asked his opinion about the Rangers and kind of, what took place this past season, which of course was just a complete disaster, as we all know. And listen, he's a big boy. Mike Sullivan is very smooth with the media. He knows how to deliver a message. He knows how to answer a question. He knows how to dodge a question. So he said it would be irresponsible for him to comment on a situation that he wasn't part of. He was coach of the Pittsburgh Penguins. He can comment on playing against the Rangers. He can comment on the talent on the Rangers and having to coach against that, how excited he is now to be the coach of that talent. He said all those things. Rangers have a lot of talent. He's excited, about the roster that they have right now. Listen, all well and good. And, that's good to know. I don't think he'd take the job if that wasn't the case, but, he confirmed that. But he said it'd be irresponsible for him to comment on what exactly went down with the Rangers. Now, and rightfully so, behind Chris Joy probably had deep conversations about this, both before and after Sully was officially named as the head coach. So that's what's important, is that those two are on the same page, and that the difficult questions and conversations were being held between them. But outside of that one question to Sullivan, there was really nothing probing about getting into Sullivan's mindset and his thinking about this team, this organization. But we learned a few nuggets. We got a few nuggets along the way. He's reached out to almost every player on the roster already. And, he's learning to get to know the guys. He wants them to get to know what he's about. So that's good. He's a known good communicator, relationship builder, and a solid coach. he gets guys, man, he gets guys to buy in, and he's gotten the biggest stars, some of the biggest stars in the game, to really play for him and buy into what he's selling. And of course, and he referenced it only once in the 20 minutes that he bring up Sidney Crosby's name, but he did use him as an example. He said there, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said there's a bigger pressure on your best players, because they're your examples. You need them. You need them to be your best players, but also your examples for everybody else on the roster, for the third line guys, the fourth line guys, the young kids, the people coming up from the minor leagues. And he referenced just basically how Sid is the gold standard when it comes to that. But that was the only time he mentioned Sid. And I'm going to do a column on this later this week, beginning of next week. But I know he doesn't know yet, and he may not know until, training camp next year. He may not know until the season is underway. But who on this roster, if he's on the roster yet, maybe there are still trades to come, etc. But who is going to be Mike Sullivan's Sidney Crosby? I get it. You're losing your mind right now. You're like, oh, Cerny, idiot. We don't have Sidney Crosby on our team. I get it. It doesn't need, I don't, that it's got to be a guy of Sid's talent, a generational player, an absolute first ballot Hall of Famer. But who? What talented player here is going to be the torchbearer for Mike Sullivan? Who's he going to build that relationship with? Adam Fox. He was asked directly about Adam Fox. He called Fox a elite, and remember he coached him at the Four Nations face-off. So he had good things to say about him. But he also had other things to say. He said that I'm also here to push guys like Adam Fox. He said not just Fox, individually, but just using him as an example because he was just asked about him. He said, I'm here to push him. I'm here to push all of them to be better, to greatness. Okay, he, in other words, he's an elite player. I'm going to push him past that, even better. Push him to his utmost limits. And I think you like hearing that for sure. He talked about the Four Nations experience and coaching the four Rangers that were there. Fox was there, Vincent Trocheck, JT Miller, and Chris Kreider. And I mean, he went over the top about their commitment, their passion to win. He said an insatiable appetite to win. And he called that group fierce competitors. Now, again, I'm doing the eye roll for you, Ranger fans, because you just lived through a season of not fierce competition from your team, from your best players on down, right? Think of all the no-shows, everything we talked about this season. So listen, for Sullivan, he's not going to delve into the past. He's aware. He's not going to delve. So he talked about his one experience with these guys. And of course, it was a high-level tournament. And to be honest, he appeared to be really speaking about that entire United States team, about their fierce competitors and an insatiable desire or appetite to win. But it comes out specifically to those four players because that's who he was, that prior to that he was asking about or talking about, from the Four Nations and the relationship that he has there. So there's that. So he spoke to all the players or most of the players so far. He did say that hasn't discussed putting the C on somebody's jersey yet. He said he and Chris Drury haven't even, discussed that topic. Said that they will. We'll see. You can wait till training camp for that. But again, he used the cliche, you don't have to have a letter on your jersey. He said the one thing that he learned in the conversation with the players is that the Rangers have a, quote, fair amount of leadership. So he was impressed, where he gave the impression that he was impressed, that there's some good leadership here, just based on the conversations that he's had with some of the players. So, those were some nuggets that stood out. Probably the biggest thing that he harped on, and there are a couple, but I think the one that he kept coming back to, and also Chris Jury spoke about this as well, is that the partnership between the coach and the GM. They have a history together, right? Sullivan, was an assistant coach when Jury was Ranger captain, playing the final 2 years of his career with the Rangers. They worked together on, United States international teams, including the Four Nations face-off. And Jury and this is, Jury's not one to open up. Right? He's not a warm and fuzzy guy. He's not one to open up and really share a lot. And he didn't today. I mean, he went straight from the book, the comments that he made. Again, he didn't talk a lot. But in talking about his relationship with Mike Sullivan, he shared a nugget, and it was a good one. It was a good anecdote, and it's just rare hearing Chris Jury speak like this. He said, back in 1997 at the World Championships, Jury at this point had played 3 years at Boston University, was still a collegiate player, but he was on the U.S. World Championship team. And he's on the bus waiting to go to the rink, sitting by himself. He says he's scared to death. He doesn't know that he belongs there. No one's really dealing with him. He's the college kid. These are, professional players playing on that team. So Mike Sullivan comes on the bus, and Sully at this point was 3-4 years into his NHL career as a forward. And Sully sits down with him. And, they had the BU connection. They were both Boston University guys, so they weren't teammates there. They never, played at the same time there. But Sully sat down with him, started talking to him, drew him out, made him feel a part of this whole thing, made him feel a part of this team. But, just good conversation, sat with him, didn't want to see him, be alone. The kid, whatever he was at that point, 20 years old or whatever, sitting by himself on this bus. And, as Jury said, scared to death. And I thought that was a really good story that he shared. It gives you some insight into who Mike Sullivan is. Listen, so much has happened since then. He's had so much experience. He's coached 2 teams in the NHL. He's been an assistant for multiple teams. He's coached on the national level. He played over 700 games in the NHL. So much happened since that moment in 1997. But that's who he is as a person. He is a relationship builder. He's a communicator. He is a leader. That is who Mike Sullivan is. And in that short little story that Chris Jury shared, I thought that was great. It was better than any accolades he could say and had said about Sullivan. But sharing that personal nugget gave you some insight into Mike Sullivan. And part of the reason why, there are many other reasons why, but part of the reason why the Jury has this personal connection and belief in Mike Sullivan as a coach. It's partly why he's wanted Sully ever since he took over as GM in 2021. That's the guy he's always. So when he became available, as we talked about at the beginning, he was going to do whatever it took to get Mike Sullivan to be the 38th coach in franchise history. So these are some of the things that stood out to me in the press conference today. One other thing stood out, and this reverts back to the talent on the Rangers. And one of the very first things he said in his introduction, before he even answered a question from the media, Sullivan said that one of the appealing parts of this job to him was the talent that's already there on the Rangers. He lauded the talent here. Mentioned how they've been knocking on the door. And I know this year the door slammed in their face December 31st, pretty much. I get that. But, he was referencing clearly, this core, the 2 Eastern Conference finals in a 3-year span. He clearly believes that team, that group, is more of what he's inheriting here than what we saw last year. And listen, he might be onto something, which to me also leads to why he's the right hire. Right? He knows that group just needs to be pushed over the edge in a positive way, pushed over the finish line. He believes he's the guy. Chris Jury believes that Sully's the guy. This isn't starting over. I'm not saying that they still don't want to change their identity of the team more and that there aren't more changes coming. They still believe there's a nucleus there that can get right back to the playoffs next season and make a run. Yeah. So anyways, talking about the talent, that's one of the big allures of why he came here. But then he made sure to send this message, just in case anybody from that roster is watching this press conference. He put it out there, and I am positive that he put it out there as much as for those guys' sakes, as it was for the fans, as it was for his new boss, as it was for the media assembled there. He said teams win championships. So you can have all the talent in the world. Teams win championships. He said, and this is the message too. I learned that through my experience. He said, we in Pittsburgh, and now I'm paraphrasing, we in Pittsburgh, we have had amazing talent, right? He didn't check them off by name, but you know the lists, right? You know, the Sidney Crosbys and the Evgeny Malkins, Chris Letang's, etc. You know, lately Eric Carlson. You know, they've had a ton of talent there. So we had the talent in Pittsburgh. But my experience is I've experienced the highs. In other words, they've won consecutive Stanley Cup championships. But I've experienced the disappointments as well, and I've learned just as much from each. Teams win championships, not talent. You think that's not a message to this roster right now? Hey, Mika, teams win championships. Hey, Keandre Miller, Alexi Lafreniere, you kids on the way up, Brennan Othman, Gabe Perreault. Teams win championships. That was the beginning of the firing the salvo. That is his message. That was my biggest takeaway from today. I think he was sending that message to his players. And maybe he's delivering it in those phone calls that he referenced as well. But he is subtle. And then, you know, in a one-on-one interview that he did with Dave Maloney on MSG, you know, he did talk a little bit more specifically about how scoring doesn't win you championships. It's about the entire game. And he started talking about the defensive game and how important it is for everybody to play, to buy in defensively. So another message, right? Now, that wasn't on the podium because it was a different question that was asked by Dave Maloney. That's going to be another key message coming from him. He knows how to hit the high marks. This guy knows what he's doing, right? He knows how to handle himself in front of his team and in front of the media and sending a message to the fans. You know, he got it all out there. Again, in a controlled environment, right? Again, I don't know what he thinks about Mika or about Keandre Miller's future. I don't know. I just know in general terms what he thinks about this roster, what a general philosophy on winning, what it takes to win championships, because he knows. And he also knows what it's like to fall short. Didn't make the playoffs the last 3 years with the Pittsburgh Penguins. They still had Crosby and Malkin and Letang and Carlson, and it's a lot of talent there. Here's another thing, a little bit subtle. So before he was even asked about how he would work with younger players, he made sure to get it out there before he was even asked. How on those championship teams of the Penguins, he brought along some young players that were major contributors on those teams. Of course, he had Sid and Gino, etc. But he made sure to mention Connor Sheary, He made sure, he didn't even mention Jay Gensel, but he also made sure, to mention other, players as well. Brian Russ, Matt Murray, tackle, you know, younger guys that he brought along. He's letting you know that I helped develop them into Stanley Cup champions, and they played key roles in our Stanley Cup championships in Pittsburgh. He wasn't asked about it. He brought that up on his own because he knows that there's this reputation that he doesn't develop young players. So he's trying to get ahead, right? The spin, he's trying to get ahead of the narrative right there. So he did that. And then he was asked about how do you handle young players? And he basically gave that one size doesn't fit all answer, which I agree with. He said, I'll treat this player this way, that player, another way. Nobody is entitled, he said. Nobody's entitled. So if you're a first round pick or you're a sixth round pick, you got to earn your way. And he said that talking about the youngsters, but talking about the role, he said, everybody earns their way. Everybody earns their way. Earn being the key word. We'll see what happens with accountability. One of the big things under Peter Laviolette was the lack of accountability, right? Especially for the veteran players. Was ice time really taken away? Yeah, we saw Zibanejad and Kreider eventually, late this season, eventually lose some ice time. But, really, for the first year and a half of his tenure, you didn't see that. So, anyway, the Laviolette tenure is over with. And Sullivan, stepped up with these comments. And some of them, were included in longer spiels, longer, mind flows, things that he's talking about, and grab onto it. And I recorded every word and I've gone back and listened to it. And these are the things, that have stood out to me. Again, not a lot. There's nothing earth shattering, but there are nuggets in there. And listen, I know Mike Sullivan. I'm not saying we're best buddies or anything like that, but I was there when he was an assistant coach with the Rangers, and certainly, I've covered him, throughout Stanley Cup playoff runs and series against the New York Rangers and everything. He is a powerful individual. He just has a presence about him, and I like that. I think this group needs that. I'm not saying Peter Laviolette didn't have a presence or great experience. Gerard Gallant. So I think they got the right guy at the end of the day. And certainly, most coaches are going to win the day, their opening press conference, especially when it's as controlled a situation as the Rangers had today. Mike Sullivan certainly didn't put his foot in his mouth, wouldn't expect him to. He didn't lose the day today, right? There's nothing today where you'd say, oh, they got the wrong guy. It's like they have the right guy, a guy that's in charge, a guy that wants to work in tandem with the GM, Chris Drury. And now things, they go in a line. See players in line. There is no question here about who's in charge. James Dolan gave out that contract extension to Chris Drury after this, god-awful season. Said, that's my guy. And here's the contract extension. And I'm going to issue a press release and tell you how great I think Chris Drury is. And he did. So anything Chris Drury does now has the full support of James Dolan. There's no question, right? So if you're going to buck the GM or now buck the new head coach who not only was hired by the GM, but is the guy that the GM's wanted for the past 4 years since he first took the job, you're running into a brick wall. You don't think that's not a message to Kreider or Tamika Zibanejad or anybody whose feathers are ruffled right now about how things were handled last season? No. Get in line or get out. We'll see. we'll see how the suburb, there's so much ahead, and we will break it down. What we think it's going to happen. Still think, I don't know that we'll see an overhaul. We've already seen the beginnings of that. JT Miller's in, the trades, Lindgren, Kako, Heedle, Trouba. Riley Smith we knew he was going to be a short-term guy here anyway, but all those guys are gone. Will Borgen is here, signed a contract. He's going to be here for a while. JT Miller's here for the long haul. Already there's a shift. I think there will be more. I will do a topic on X this week. I posted a story. Molly Walker last week on Rink Rap came on and she said, the Rangers should explore what they might be able to get for Alexi Lafreniere. Okay. It's a fair take. She didn't say trade him or give him away or, get him out of the room or whatever. Around him is, it's worth exploring. There's something missing with this guy. And I respect that. She's around him every day. I know she's not part of the team, but she's around him every day. She's got insight, and I respect that. So I wrote the article, with her quotes and everything, and, kind of gave both sides of the story. So we post the story. The page views, it's doing great. People are really interested in the story. But what I found most interesting about this is that when it comes to Alexi Lafreniere, there's no gray, right? Like, I feel gray about Alexi Lafreniere. I think Molly feels gray about Alexi Lafreniere. But what we found, at least the people that were getting involved on X with their tweets and, going back and forth and commenting on the story and either supporting Molly or supporting me or running us both down or, whatever, was that it's black and white. Right? There's this group that absolutely loves Alexi Lafreniere. Everybody else has failed Alexi Lafreniere. It's mass failure around Alexi Lafreniere. Nothing's his fault. Okay. It's one take. And then there's the flip side. You have the other group, again, black or white, that says, got to get rid of him. He's the biggest bust ever, worst first overall picks, since yada, yada. He'll never be this. Capo Caco was even better, and we traded him. And, I'm just pulling things out of here that, I read that people wrote. And here's the thing. Both sides are partially right. Both sides are partially wrong. There is gray area here. You cannot make a player blameless for his growth, lack of growth, or falling back. You can't just say, the entire team sucked this year, so it's okay that Alexi Lafreniere wasn't good. And it's gone. That's a player who we thought was all going to take off this season. And he took a big step back. And, I know the analytics and I presented them fairly in the story. His analytics are some of the best on the team, best among the forwards, right? We got to watch the games too. It's both. And you can weigh one more than the other. But what I see, what I read, the numbers that I see, dive into, the traditional stats, the underlying stats, and the eye test. It's not just black or white with Alexi Lafreniere. So that's a whole windup for me to say, sure, I agree with Molly. I'd say you can get for anybody on this roster right now, right? Not a lot of untouchables on this roster. But I wouldn't be eager to trade 24-year-old Alexi Lafreniere. I'd be more eager to let Mike Sullivan get his hands on the kid. No, not so much a kid anymore, entering his 6th NHL season, but you get the point. I see what Sullivan can do with him. Probably feel the same about Keandre Miller too. At the end of the day, but it's not black or white. It's not. Oh, this guy sucks. He's the worst. Oh, he's the worst. He's such a disappointment. Never be any good with the Rangers, and it can't be the other. Oh, we always trade the young guys, and it should be hands off. We should let him develop. Yeah, well, I know it's been 5 years, but he's only 24. And look, everybody else around him, Panarin brings him down defensively. Nobody gives him any help. They don't put him on the power play. I get it. All right. I get it. It's not all one or the other. But what I do love is the passion of you fans. You guys rock. I just let you all just go off. Even if some of you were tearing into me or tearing into Molly and, whatever, mocking us, our opinions or whatever. I don't care. What I like is the passion behind it. And we'll see. Time will tell. We'll see what they do with guys like Keandre Miller and Alexi Lafreniere. And I think they're both going to be on the opening night roster next season. That's just my belief. But we'll see. We'll see if it ends up, if they end up progressing to where they should, or if they fall short, or if it was a mistake to hold on to them. Did they hold on to them too long? Whatever. Time will tell on all of that. And that's what makes all of this so, fascinating, in the bigger picture. In any case, so that's kind of my wind down, if you will, from the Mike Sullivan press conference on Thursday. Love to hear what you all think. Make sure to hit me up on X at Jim at Forever Blueshirts. Continue to like and subscribe over at YouTube and listen to us on your favorite audio outlets. And we'll be back next week. We're going to continue, with the Mike Sullivan stories and backgrounds. Today, tomorrow, over the weekend, into next week. A lot of Mike Sullivan material will be coming your way. And also the looking ahead. Who should the Rangers, or how should they restructure or structure the roster for next season? What are the most important decisions they have to make? What are things that we didn't get answers to today that we would have liked to get answers to? There's so much still to go into. All of that will be found at Blueshirts, foreverblueshirts.com. Again, thank you for tuning in. Thanks for joining us. And oh man, we didn't even get into the draft lottery. And Rangers got to make a big decision there with the number 112 pick overall. But we've got time. We'll get into that next week, I promise. Talk about what the Islanders, Islanders, the arch rivals, they have the number 1 overall pick. We'll get into what they could do as well. We'll bring in a guest next week. Got a couple ideas. We'll see who's available to join us. And we'll get to all of that next week and each and every week throughout the off season right here on Rink Rap. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll catch you next week.